This is going to be an interview that takes the form of a conversation, and it's actually comes pretty closely off, one of Tom's notes at the end of the last panel, which was, there's a lot going on in water today, and water is getting moved around, and it's an issue that is only going to get bigger and bigger. So what we're going to talk about for the next 45 minutes or so is the price of an aging infrastructure on the environment, and specifically on this is water. So as our guest, we have Jennifer Pierre, who is General Manager of the State Water Contractors. She's an expert in water supply, restoration management. As the General Manager of State Water Contractors, she's developed the whole framework for the state's management of water supply and ecological issues within the Delta, as well as a number of other areas. So her background is very, very intensively focused on the whole question of water supply, management, all of those aspects. And then interviewing and leading the conversation will be Stefanie Morris. And Stefanie is a partner for BB&K and also served as the in-house counsel for the State Water Contractors before she joined the firm in 2017. So she has tremendous experience in all aspects of water management and litigation. So I'm going to turn it over to her to start, and welcome to both of you.
Thank you. So usually when we're having these kind of conversations, there's a giant whiteboard behind us, and it looks like a bomb exploded on the back, lots of ideas. What we wanted to do is kind of give a little bit of background before we went into the conversation. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, and she's going to walk through sort of the importance of the State Water Project for California and some of the history before we kind of dig into the infrastructure questions. So don't be alarmed, we're going to talk about Oroville, and we're definitely going to talk about tunnels because we love tunnels. So without further ado, here's Jennifer.
Thank you. Yeah, we just thought it'd be helpful to just walk through what the infrastructure of the State Water Project is and what the role the State Water Contractors, who we represent, is in relation to the State Water Project. So this map is showing the State Water Project. I think recently in the news, a lot of people have just seen Oroville, or you've only heard about the California water fix and the tunnels, but in fact there is a substantial amount of infrastructure associated with the state project, including a number of pumping plants, hundreds of miles of canals, electric generation facilities, and then of course we have Oroville, but a few other reservoirs as well. So the map kind of just shows you how extensive the project is, and as it goes along that this kind of artery here, it's serving many of the residents of California as it moves through the state. We'll talk about this in more detail in a bit, but here's the Oroville facilities. So I don't have a pointer, but you can see the primary lake, and then it generates electricity and it goes into this after bay that's in the bottom corner of the graphic there. It's a pretty complex facility with a lot of different utility and uses going on in that area. Once it moves down the Sacramento River, it goes into the Delta, which is also called the Bay Delta. So this is near the Golden Gate Bridge, for those of you not familiar with the area. But the water actually moves in natural channels all the way from Oroville through the Feather River, down the Sacramento River, and into the Delta, where it is exported by the State Water Project export facilities in the south portion of the Delta. I've got those shown here as Clifton Court, Forebay, and Bakes Pumping Plant are the State Water Project facilities, export facilities. We also, I'm pointing here at a North Bay Aqueduct, so this is another export facility of the Solano County Water Agency, which is a State Water Project contractor as well. So the State Water Project is a facility that is owned and maintained by the state, the Department of Water Resources, but they contract with 29 public water agencies to deliver that water. And the State Water Contractors, my organization, represents 27 of those 29 contractors. All our members, our State Water Project contractors, plus the two that aren't the State Water Contract members, they pay all of the O&M and capital. So they are basically billed by the state, and the state uses those dollars in order to maintain the facilities, including Oroville, and eventually, hopefully, WaterFix. Just for context on who we serve collectively is 25 million people throughout the state. many here in Southern California, but also in the southern area of the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as areas like Napa and Solano County, the city of Yuba City, Butte, and Plumas counties. And also a lot of ag, 750,000 acres of ag land, primarily in the San Joaquin Valley. So if you like almonds, they're probably grown with State Water Project water. And this is just showing a map of those contractors. So who are the public water agencies that are contracting for water and where are they located? And you can see that there is a concentration in Southern California, but that there are many contractors that are spread in the Central Valley as well as in the northern parts of California. So I'll go back. There we go. And so that's who we are.
I think the context is important in this discussion because we're talking about a really complex system that starts in Oroville. And with the extreme weather events that we are now experiencing, that California's current infrastructure wasn't really built or designed to deal with these kinds of current weather patterns we're seeing. And I was just wondering if you could comment on your thoughts for the future and how the State Water Project through the Department of Water Resources can ensure water reliability with these changes in climate that we're seeing.
Sure. Well, I'm sure as many of you experienced, 2014 was the driest year on record and 2017 was the wettest year on record, just a few years apart. And there's been a flurry of articles yesterday and today, you may have noticed, throughout the state papers and I think even national news, indicating that we should expect a very volatile next century in California and in the West in terms of more intensive flooding, more intensive droughts, and them coming more rapidly at us. And our infrastructure wasn't really built that way. In California, our biggest reservoir is snowpack, and our system was built so that it would slowly melt, the reservoirs would slowly fill, and we would slowly release that water for export, primarily in the growing and summer seasons for agricultural and urban uses. Well, what's happening instead is now we're just going to get bombarded with floods, and we don't have the storage capacity. It's not going to be in snow so much as it'll be in rain. And so we need ways to capture that and manage that. Our facilities in California serve multiple functions. They serve flood control functions, so they're capturing flood flows. The Lake Oroville was built in 1959, completed. And while it was being constructed, there was a very large flood that actually saved the downstream communities. We often forget that the function of a lot of our reservoirs is also protecting downstream communities. They serve water supply purposes, they serve recreation purposes, and but they were not built to serve, to be flexible, really. And that's actually what we need, and a lot of what the state water contractors are looking to invest in and looking to adjust existing infrastructure is to be able to be more flexible. So how do we capture those flood flows, get it to where, first of all, protect downstream communities, but then move that water and use that water when it's available and take pressure off the system and the environment when it's not available. And I think that Water Fix, for example, is a project that is primarily intended to address that flexibility in order to capture those high peak flows coming on the Sacramento River, move them south of the Delta to where there's storage and a demand, and then take pressure off of the Delta and the system when those storm flows are not available. And all the modeling and indication, whether you believe in climate change or not, is showing us that those are the types of infrastructure we need to be building into the State Water Project and other water infrastructure.
You said the Water Fix word, so we have to step back and unpack that a little bit. So Water Fix, it originally started as a HCCP. And it was intended to give water suppliers and department some certainty, but also to protect the environment and to deal with some of the Endangered Species Act issues, as well as bringing back some species, recovering. So beyond just the Section 7 requirements. So I'm wondering if you could sort of comment on the transition from what was the project formerly known as BDCP to Water Fix, and walk us through some of the benefits that you perceive from Water Fix.
Okay. So multi-species conservation plan was referenced in the last panel and is looks like being successfully implemented in the Coachella Valley, which is excellent news. The Bay Delta Conservation Plan was meant to be a similar sort of program. It was the first aquatic habitat conservation plan attempted in the United States and failed, unfortunately. Aquatic species are a little bit different animal, but the idea behind Bay Delta Conservation Plan was similar to what we heard about from Coachella Valley, which is setting aside areas and programs that were protective of species and providing a means for recovery. I believe we had 42 covered species, so there were 12 fish and the remainder were terrestrial animals and plants. It was meant to be a 50-year permit. And it included not just the construction and operation of the conveyance facilities, but 21 other conservation measures meant to benefit species. Ultimately, I think it didn't come to fruition in part because it was a 50-year permit request, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty in water planning around what operations might look like in 50 years. And I think that was problematic to work through. And like I said, this is the first aquatic permit, so it kind of was facing a lot of challenges in that regard. So what the state of California decided to do was basically bifurcate the program into the infrastructure for the conveyance facility and the infrastructure for the habitat conservation components related to restoration, aquatic weed control, predation management, et cetera. And I'm happy to say that it's not just the tunnel component that's moving forward, although it certainly gets the most attention in the news, but a lot of the other components are moving forward as well, and the state water contractors are very engaged in the kind of sister program, which the state calls Eco Restore, which is the construction of 8,000 acres of tidal restoration and 17,000 acres of floodplain. But in addition to that, we're also pursuing things like a Delta Smelt hatchery program. We're looking at predation management. We fund many scientific programs that address a lot of these other stressor issues. So I think the program as a whole is still moving forward. It's just not necessarily under a habitat conservation plan, which on the one hand is good that these things are moving forward, but on the other hand presents a lot of uncertainty to the system and how we operate when, having had an HCP, we would have most likely been able to maximize the flexibility of the infrastructure that will be invested in by our water users.
You kind of raised some regulatory issues. So that's just another sort of layer of complexity in the Bay Delta is there are coordinated operations between the Central Valley Project, which is the federal project, and the state water project. And those operations are regulated by several things that impact water supply, largely due to protecting public trust resources like fish and water quality for other beneficial uses. So D1641, the current water quality control plan, regulations, and then the ESA, so the biological opinions for salmon and smelt. And was one of the issues or do you think it's an issue moving forward for water purveyors to invest in infrastructure given the uncertainty of the amount of water supply that they will be able to obtain from the Delta?
I'm a big believer in the California water fix. I think this was always contemplated as part of the state water project, and I think it's a necessary component of it to make it really work. I think there's also a need to invest in smaller infrastructure and in kind of expansion of portfolios at a local level, which many of our public water agencies do. So I think, in general, moving into this century, it's, for me, my background's in biology, and it's been an interesting shift to kind of watch, even in my short career, a shift from kind of an engineer, just go build that levee, build that tunnel, build that road, and we'll deal with the environment later, to kind of a more comprehensive approach to these infrastructure solutions and also looking beyond infrastructure. But in the case of water fix, it really is absolutely necessary in order to make the rest of the infrastructure, which, by the way, the public water agencies have invested billions of dollars since the 50s and 60s in. So it makes no financial sense to abandon this infrastructure. So I do think that the water fix is kind of the last piece of infrastructure. It is beneficial to the environment. It was always contemplated in order to make the point of diversion for the State Water Project more fish friendly. And I think our modeling and our analysis that we've been working on for now 11 years shows that. And we have 2 non-jeopardy biological opinions, And I think a lot of opportunity for restoration. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question exactly. You want to talk about coordinated operations as well? Okay, then I won't.
It's too messy, and it's going to change anyways, no doubt. So let's step back in terms of what lessons can we learn. So you talked a lot about the infrastructure before. It was just build, deal with the environment later. But we did see, as the State Water Project was being developed in conjunction with the Central Valley Project, these multi-use facilities. So, for example, Oroville, it's not only flood control and water supply purposes, but it provides recreation, and as well as an important part of generating basically clean energy from hydroelectric plant generation. So how can we take some of those lessons we learned with building multi-use facilities and perhaps translate it into some more green infrastructure? And how would you envision that working in the Delta to not only help benefit the environment, but also to provide water supply benefits to the state of California? These are easy questions, right?
They're long. I want to make sure I answer them. I think, the status of the environment is linked to the status of water supply, and I think that is something most water supply managers are coming to realize, that we can't really fight the environment anymore. And so working with it and improving together is really key, I think, in order to being successful. As State Water Project contractors, we believe in collaboration, and I think that we're trying to foster that as much as we can. Like I mentioned before, we have this Eco Restore program, which is really requiring us to do a number of restoration activities. When you look at where that restoration is going to occur, it occurs right in some of our important flood control structure areas, and it also occurs in some of our, I wouldn't consider them in LA, but there are definitely populous areas in and around the Delta. And being able to develop projects in coordination with, for example, local flood control agencies that are actually restoring not just acres, but flood processes that I think are going to restore the environment, which then take pressure off of the water supply system. And being at the table with those flood agencies and those local jurisdictions that are working on something not at all related to fish protection necessarily, but being able to collaborate with them, pull monies and resources and ideas. And I'm hoping what it'll do is we won't be sued. We're actually restoring the natural process instead of just saying, okay, well, I checked my box, I did my acres. We're saying, no, this is actually a function in the environment we're restoring. And being able to be at the table to make sure that where we do this restoration, how we do it, doesn't actually impact, for example, our water quality or cause other indirect effects that create problems for us, is a huge opportunity. And I would call it my number 2 priority at the state contractors right now, because it is, again, a really important component of what we're doing. But I think there's a lot of work that can be done there. So I'm definitely actively working on that.
And could you comment on some potential habitat placement that may actually help reduce the inflow? So you kind of talked about the Delta as an environment and the tidal impact, and maybe just briefly comment on some of the studies that have been going on that may help benefits water supply by not having to make additional releases from reservoirs to repel salinity, and what you're studying there.
Yeah, I'm going to pull up a map, which I think I want to use this one. So one of the unique things about the Bay Delta is, unlike other deltas, which are kind of, they widen out. So if you think about the Mississippi River Delta or Chesapeake Bay or other major deltas, they go the other way. So this one kind of starts wide and goes narrow versus others that kind of enter the ocean at a wide. And so it creates really interesting dynamics in tidal and energy dynamics. And so there's an ability to place the restoration in a way that changes the way that energy is moving on the water in the Delta, that can actually be very interactive with how we move water in the Delta. And so we're studying a lot of different ways to say, okay, how might you place the restoration, which changes the tidal energy in a way that complements water operations and provides benefits to the environment. And so this modeling, I would say, is relatively new in the last few years, but it's something we're getting more 3D modeling. We're able to incorporate wind suspension and all sorts of factors that will help us understand, okay, how do we both place infrastructure and operate infrastructure in conjunction with other changes in the geometry of this delta that can actually benefit the environment.
And actually, let's go back one slide. So this is my favorite slide. This is from DWR bulletin, and this shows sort of, it's hard to see, but you can get the general gist of it. The before is before State Water Project, CVP, and you can see that line is moving all the way up and through the delta, and that's the salinity. And then what you see after on the right screen is that after the projects come online, we're managing salinity to keep it out of the interior of the delta, to protect agriculture in the delta, and also to have better water quality to export. So one of the benefits that is alleged for water fix is water supply reliability, given some of these potential levee failures from earthquakes, and also increased water supply. Can you sort of expand on some of the additional benefits from building a $17.1 billion two-tunnel project?
Sure. So what this is showing is essentially that we're using reservoir releases from Shasta, Folsom, and Oroville to keep salt water at bay. So under natural conditions, it's like a big bathtub slushing salt back and forth, even salt water going all the way up into Sacramento American River at times. Now we like to keep it way far downstream of there. And we're using the water that's captured in the reservoirs to do that. Well, in dry years, like we had the massive drought recently, it was very dire in the Delta, and it caused major problems in terms of aquatic weeds, temperature issues, et cetera. What WaterFix does is it changes where we're diverting water. So instead of requiring the water to move from Feather River, Sacramento River, all the way down through the Delta to the bottom of the Delta where it's currently exported, we're changing the point of diversion about 30 miles upstream on the Sacramento River, where it can be diverted. It's fresher water. It doesn't need to move through those channels that are subject to earthquakes. I don't know if anyone saw the USGS study that came out, I think Thursday or Friday. The Bay Area is not in a good spot right now for earthquakes. It's like 73% chance by 2040 they have a 7.0 magnitude, and like 38 plus days of water cutoffs for even cities that are right here. Anyway, I digress. There's definitely a major earthquake issue. The other benefit to WaterFix is that as sea level rises, that salinity intrusion is going to get more and more inland, and there just isn't enough water. I mean, you've got 3 reservoirs and an ocean. Which one's going to win, right? So being able to put the diversion points where the water is more likely to be fresher provides benefit to the export community because it's moving that fresher water. It doesn't mix with the Delta. It also doesn't cause reverse flows. So it's kind of weird, but the San Joaquin River flows, in my mind, upstream. It's really downstream, but it flows south to north. And so it wants to flow north, but as we pull water into the export, it's kind of causing reverse flows under certain conditions, and fish get confused. So even though we may not actually be pulling them into the export facilities physically, we might be distracting them, changing their migratory routes, and subjecting them what we call a bad neighborhood, which is the South Delta. By moving the point of diversion, the water's kind of sweeping past. We're at a storm flow condition, so we're skimming off kind of the top portion of the flow, and the fish migration route is less impacted than under the current conditions. So that is actually the basis for this piece of infrastructure. That's why it was Conservation Measure 1 in a Habitat Conservation Plan. It really was intended to be a conservation measure. And again, I think that there's strong recognition among the State Water Project contractors, and I would even say the Central Valley Project contractors, whom I don't represent, that this project does provide environmental benefits, and that providing benefits to the environment provides reliability for water supply, and that's why they're going to spend $17.1 billion to build this infrastructure.
And maybe you could comment a little bit on, that is a large sum of money. This is probably the largest water infrastructure project, definitely in California, in the last 20, 30 years. There's been a lot of criticisms that the project doesn't create new water supply. And so maybe you could comment on why you think water purveyors and state water contractors are still interested in building this infrastructure?
It's been an interesting transition for me. I've been working on this project since 2011, and I remember some public water agencies, probably the majority of them, when we were showing them the models and incorporating climate change. And again, we were looking at a 50-year program at that time, so really looking out to the year 2060 and showing water supply just goes like this. And it's because of climate change and nothing else. And at first we're like, get out of here, I don't think so. And then we had the drought, and Folsom went to Deadpool, and there were no tunnels. So I think people have really come around to seeing that climate change predictions are perhaps not exactly right in terms of exact numbers, but the trends are proving out to be correct. And because of that, people are acknowledging that the water supply impacts of climate change, of not just extended droughts, but of sea level rise that impacts salinity, combined with what we see as a regulatory trend that continues to tighten the screws on operations, as something that needs to be mitigated against. And so even though this piece of infrastructure doesn't necessarily say, oh, well, this is the new water that you're gonna receive, it's protecting, again, billions, tens of billions of dollars that the public water agencies have been making for the last 4 or 5 decades in this infrastructure, so that they continue to receive and can rely on the water supplies that they're receiving today.
And now for the big elephant in the room question. So we talk about the need for infrastructure and how the climate's changing. What is the biggest impediment to building large-scale infrastructure in water, like WaterFix? Is it legal? Is it financial? Is it political? In your mind, what is it?
There are people that would prefer the status quo, even though they'll also acknowledge that it's unsustainable. And this is one of the areas I look at, for example, the Colorado River, and maybe not as of the last week, there's been a lot of drama on there, but before that, they basically all recognized that they were in it together, that they needed to come up with a solution together, and I think we really lack that in California, at least in the Bay Delta area, and so it really comes down to political. The fact that not all parties really want to come to the table and find a solution makes the people that are trying to find a solution constantly working uphill trying to do something. I think Metropolitan's vote, was that 2 weeks ago, was incredibly courageous and demonstrated a lot of leadership, which was absolutely needed, not just on this project, but on so many fronts in water in California. And so I was really pleased that they did that. But I think it really does come down to the fact that politically, it's advantageous for some people, stakeholders, to fight any sort of change, even in the face of knowing that as things are, there's going to be a catastrophe if we don't do something about it.
Which might account for 23 different lawsuits on WaterFix before construction's even started.
That's right.
Just some final comments, I think, on overall, what do you see in the Delta, because things haven't changed? I think there's this perception of, if you go back and look 30 years in a document and you read it today, it's like, oh, we're still dealing with the same problems. We haven't solved the issues with species, the reverse flow issues. So what is the thing in the Delta that is gonna break the kicking down the road sort of mentality that we have had in California in regards to water infrastructure? It's a totally easy question.
I mean, I think that it could be as simple as a dry day levee break, which we had in 2005, if I recall, that just changes completely the hydrodynamics without any real desire to fix that. And I think that could kick off a series of events that kind of grow. But I wanted to mention that, Plan A, B, C, and D are WaterFix. We're gonna get this project done. But in the meantime, one of the things that the state water contractors are investing heavily in is science, because uncertainty has been a major impediment to getting anything done. It allows regulatory agencies to kind of hide behind being ultra conservative. It gives them just one knob to turn and it's ours. And so, in a very collaborative way, we've been trying to fund science that allows us to better understand things like reverse flows, predation, entrainment issues, how outflow impacts and interacts with species in the environment. And I think if we continue to make those investments, we're gonna hone in on some good information that allows us to better improve things. Because even if let me take that back. When we build WaterFix, it'll still take 15 years. So we do have work to do in between now and then, and I think there's a lot to do, and we are doing what we can to try to understand that and work against that and come up with what I'd call our near-term plan before we implement plan A, B, C, and D.
Which are all WaterFix.
Yes.
At this point, I wanted to open it up. I have more questions, but I really wanted to allow the audience an opportunity to ask questions.
Thank you. My name is Charity Schuller. I'm with Best and Krieger. And I think there's maybe a misperception on the part of the public that everything that happens in the Delta is due to water diversions or water withdrawals. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on some of the other factors that contribute to the Delta's current condition.
Well, here's a good example from 2017. So we have this requirement in our biological opinion that in falls following wet and above normal years, we have to release a ton of water. In fact, this year was 600,000 acre feet. And to protect Delta smelt. So, but they all died in the summer because it was too hot, and operations can't do anything about that. And that's just one really easy example of the massive disconnect between the regulation on the water projects and what's actually happening in the Delta. I'm not pleased that they all died because of the temperature, but the data is so strong there this year that it's finally we can point to something and just say this is how ridiculous it is that everything you're doing is regulating water operations, when in fact we could be doing things such as creating refuge habitat where we know there's like pockets of cooler areas. And so in fact, we're working with the fish agencies and the Department of Water Resources this summer, to implement a program of that nature. So other things, for example, include predation. We have more non-native species in the Delta than native species. We have massive aquatic weed problems. There's a number of marinas. There's a lot of boating in the Delta as well. They chop up aquatic weeds. They spread them all over. Increased temperatures contribute to that as well. There's holes that are 20 feet deep on the San Joaquin River, and striped bass just hang out. And when the juvenile salmon go over them, they just eat them. And for a while, we were like, that's so weird. These tags are just stopping. So we had these tagged fish, and they were just like stopping in the San Joaquin River. And then we realized that they were being eaten and then excreted by striped bass in this spot. And so, there's so many issues, but those things, I think, because they don't have a centralized party to regulate, don't get regulated. And again, that's where a lot of our science activities and the collaboration we're working on are trying to come into play to kind of, not to say that we can't mitigate for our impacts, but that there are other impacts to be mitigated and that the problem's not going to be solved on the backs of the projects.
Another issue, I think, with infrastructure that keeps coming up in my mind is when we built these large water infrastructure projects in the West, they were driven by the federal government and the state government. And so, for example, for the state water project, the state funded it with general obligation bonds, and then they were repaid. All that money was repaid back to the state by the water contractors. And in terms of WaterFix, are you seeing that same kind of leadership from the state and federal government in investing in these infrastructure projects?
Not at all. The concept on WaterFix has been user pays, so it's going to be 100% paid for by the ratepayers, and all of the planning activities have been 100% paid for by the ratepayers, despite audits at both the state and federal level to try to uncover, expenditures that weren't supposed to occur. So it does make it really challenging. Our second largest public water agency is an agricultural entity, and most of the Central Valley project, the federal side of the project, is agriculture. And it's very difficult for them to make an investment in something that they're not going to see a water supply benefit from it for 15 years, because they're doing annual loans, essentially annual mortgages on their properties in order to plant crops. And not having the federal government especially, or even the state government, who is very supportive of this project, providing financial assistance provides an extra challenge on top of all the political and environmental challenges that we've been facing in planning the project.
Okay, any other questions? Oh.
Just following up on the pricing question, I guess. You mentioned the need for local projects, which exists even if, or when WaterFix gets built. And one of the recent arguments I've heard against WaterFix is there's not enough money for both of those things, the local projects and the WaterFix, if you load it all on, say, people in the MWD service area. I mean, what are your thoughts about that going forward and how we pay for both, since we clearly need both?
That assertion continues to be made by NRDC and others, and it's just wrong. And it's been proven to be wrong. You can look at, for example, Metropolitan's recent vote looking at not only the fact that State Water Project water is by far the cheapest water supply for any of our public water agencies, but the fact that it isn't precluding them from making other investments anywhere. They've been making those investments. For example, if you don't have a water supply to recycle, then what good is a water recycling facility? State Water Project provides the backbone to these other components, and none of our public water agencies are saying, oh, well, if we do this, we're not doing recycling, we're not doing conservation, we're not doing groundwater recharge. They're doing all of the above, and I think they're required to. They have urban water management plans, they need to show sustainability under drought, so it's such a false argument that continues to be perpetuated, and there's no data at all to support that, and so I think it's just wrong.
And we can quote Jeff Keitlinger's famous, for the cost of a latte a month, you get water fix. So I think, with large urban agencies, there is ability to spread these costs, and they are continuing to invest in other infrastructure. Great, I think we're right on time, and thank you so much.